Thanks, Gary, and thanks everybody for having us. This is quite an honor to get to tell you guys what it is that we've been doing at Woodleaf Farm all this time. I want to start with just how I started this farm back in the early and mid 70s. I started working on farms just out of high school, and then at about 20 years of age started planting trees and picking fruit, and started a grafting business and started saving some money. And after just a year and a half or 2 years, had enough of a down payment for an inexpensive piece of land, and that's what we were able to buy at that time, was the first 10 acres out of this 26 acres. And so now it's a contiguous 26 acres. But instead of buying in the valley, we chose to find some place that had, what we felt like was, nice forest around it. And so Woodleaf is that. It's the oak and pine forest, 1,300 foot elevation. So kind of above we get valley fog, but we're above the valley fog in the wintertime most of the time. And it's apart from other, main agricultural systems down in the valley, where it's just farmland just right up next to each other. We don't really have neighbors. We have oak and pine forest. And so it's a nice, just a nice place to be away and also to farm. But with that came some very shallow soil that it took a while to figure out, how to make this productive enough to actually make a living off of. And so right from the beginning, I spent a few years working off the farm, but by 1984, I started just farming, making enough of a living doing farmers market and wholesale at the time to make a living doing farming. And so we're going to go through just some of the strategies. I'm going to work on explaining the irrigation system and especially the soils, and a little bit on the disease control, and then Helen will take over with all of the wildlife and the insect life and how that kind of works. So the talk is about mimicking nature, which is, I don't think you can really mimic nature, but we're going to do our best to show you the systems that we've figured out that work with kind of the least. We're always looking for how we can do less. The farm is pretty much run by one man that comes up from Mexico for 4 months, 2 months in the spring. He's there right now helping do the spring pruning. And then he'll come in the middle of summer to help us with the bulk of the harvest, and then he goes back after just 2 months. And then last year was a pretty busy year. We had one other young college student, and so she worked with us, and so it was 3 of us in our 50s pretty much run the farm. And then Misha last year in her 20s, and she thought she was the strongest, but after not that many weeks of only getting 2 days off a week, and she said, "You guys never take a day off," and she couldn't quite believe that we were able to keep going. So the hardy farmer, I think there's some truth there anyway, and so she kept it together, and by the 3 months that she was there, she was strong, and she says, "I'm not sure I want this farm life. This is a lot of work," but she was incredible too. So mimicking nature and soil building without tillage. And so the NRCS came up with their soil initiative. And so it came up with these 4 premises of how to, take care of soil to the point where it's going to actually, you're investing in soil. It's getting better. You're not deteriorating the soil. So these are the 4 points that they came up with, and so I'm going to go through and explain kind of how we hit each point. And so I really like that their conservation service and they're explaining that these things, and a big part of this is not tilling. And so a lot of what we do are figuring out systems, even in our vegetable system, where we're not tilling. And so you can see the trees, and then you can see in between, we start out with, I seed a perennial clover that quickly gets taken over with weedy grasses and all kinds of things you would call weeds, like the curly dock that you can see in that picture in the left, and then also chickweed, and every season has different weeds, and Helen will talk more about the different kinds. But with this shallow soil that we've got, it's a class 7 soil, and so they start out with 1 being great soil and 2 and 3 pretty good soils, and that's what most of the farmers farm with. Well, class 7 sounds quite a few grades lower than that, and indeed it is. And so what we have is just about a foot of soil, sometimes 2 feet, and then a big heavy clay layer, and then rock, and then in one of our fields just a healthy foot of soil and then rock. So it's a pretty weak field. So figuring out how to use what most people in this country especially would consider marginal farmland and turn it into productive farmland. And so to me it's pretty much all to do with how do you get that soil really working? And so it starts with the soil. You hear that probably a lot, but it does seem to start with the soil. Let me go back just a second. So Helen's got her hand there on the curly dock, and so we just dug down and picked up one so you could see the root on that. And so the soil where we did that went a little over a foot, and then those roots go, another 6 or 8 inches. So they're working their way down into that heavier clay, pulling up nutrition, making air channels as they die. When we mow, some of those roots die, makes good air channels for life in the soil to feed on those roots, and then air to come down so that there's, all that life in the soil needs air. So by creating this diversity, living mulch with a diversity of different kinds of plants is really important. We don't plant it. It just seems to come in. The clover's the only thing, or clover and grass mix now is the only thing I plant. So then the other thing that we do is we apply different kinds of carbon sources. We don't add any manures or fertilizers that are potent fertilizers like feather meal or some of the other fertilizers. What we do are all carbon source materials, which I would have thought in my early years of farming that wouldn't have enough nutrition in it to give us a crop. But what I've found more recently is that all the numbers, you'll see some charts coming up, show that it's just like, wow, everything's building in strength, which is wonderful on this kind of a marginal soil that isn't marginal at all anymore. Actually, it's kind of wonderful. But what we're doing is we're adding different kinds of carbon. So a carbon that's like the grasses on the left picture, we just had mowed. The grasses just get into soil contact as best as they can, and then we turn on our micro sprinklers and try and water that in so it gets in contact with the soil. And so that's kind of a quick release fertilizer. Quick in our case, because it still has to get broken down by the organisms in the soil so that it can get released to the roots. But it's pretty quick. And then what we're doing right now is we have bloom. So the peaches are blooming and the apples and pears are starting. And so we're going through the peaches right now, which you can see in that picture on the right. And so there are the prunings. And so the prunings are, not very big, most of them. And so they'll just get mowed up and it'll be kind of a heavier carbon source. And then any of the firewood, you can see one little pile of firewood up there to the right. And so that is going to get pulled out of the orchard and not get mowed in. We could chip it or something, but we just use it as firewood. And so you've got different kinds of all surface applied, no tillage in the whole system. The orchard that we're looking at with the mowing, that's looks like about an 8-year-old orchard. So we go from 20 or 30 years between having to rotate from one kind of orchard to another kind of orchard. And so in that whole time, all we're doing is mowing. And so the minimal soil disturbance. So we only I've got a number of different kind of mowing systems, but it's just taking that living mulch with all that diversity of crops in there, weeds most people would call them, but different grasses and clovers too, and then mowing them. And so the strategy in this picture is to just go under the skirts of the trees so that the sprinklers can get water out to the centers. The sprinklers are under the trees. And then I built this mower that'll kind of go underneath the skirts of the trees, but leave the middle. So that's the habitat that we're leaving down the middle. But again, no cultivation, so not turning the soil. What I found in the 80s when we did vegetable farming then too, was we'd till and we'd add as much compost as the orchard, and the organic matter kept going up a little bit, but the vegetables, it never did go up. It stayed, even though we were adding a fair amount of compost. The organic matter in the soil, the number that we would come up with was always around 2%, never really building much higher than that. And so here's a picture of kind of the picture on the right there anyway, shows some serious pruning that we had to do right then, and so a lot of carbon. And so this is kind of a really, it's hardwood. Beech is kind of a hardwood, and then break that down as best we can with, that's just a rotary mower. I'll go over with one more rotary mower, try and break it down, get it in soil contact again, do the irrigation to kind of get it into soil contact, but that's all just irrigation. And then it doesn't take very long before you've got that high carbon, kind of really strong organic matter that now is going to be broken down slowly into humus. It'll take not very many months. In this case, our soil's pretty biologically active. There's just a lot of life trying to pull down whatever we're putting